So I started reading de Châtelet's Foundations of Physics pretty much a decade ago now. And at the time, what took me to de Châtelet was that I was really interested in unsolved philosophical problems in the wake of Newton's Principia. And one of the issues that's up in the air in the early 18th century is the appropriate method for doing physics or for doing natural philosophy. So if we think about the situation in the early 18th century, on the one hand, we've got Descartes and the kind of rampant and permanent underdetermination that his method leads to. I think this is a kind of epistemic catastrophe. And then on the other hand, we have the kind of the experimental philosophy of Newtonians, and that Newton lays claim to in the third edition of the Principia. But for the most part there, the method isn't explicitly explained. And even when the protagonists do talk about it, they don't say enough either about the method itself or about the kind of epistemology and metaphysics that comes packaged with the method. And it's pretty unclear what's going on. So what I want to talk about today is du Châtelet's scientific methodology against the background of this context. Here are the things that I want to kind of put in front of us. So there are different ways of framing how we read Châtelet, and different ways that we frame it make different things seem important and visible, and other things sort of downplay things. And I want to look at her methodology and her chapter on hypotheses in the preceding chapters through a particular lens that I'm going to call Pemberton's challenge. So I'm going to suggest that we read her as responding to this challenge, and that if we do so, we can then see that the principles of our knowledge play two roles in responding to this challenge. One, in terms of the constraints on a good hypothesis, and the second in securing epistemic foundations for scientific knowledge. So these things with respect to the second claim, I think, are like broadly familiar, but I think that setting them in the context of Pemberton's challenge gives us some new insights. And I'll talk a little bit about this with respect to the third claim, which is to do with the transformation of the epistemic status of knowledge claims in physics that becomes visible if we think about what du Châtelet is doing in the context of Pemberton's challenge. Okay, so again, I can't get stuff to move, so let me do it with the cursor. All right. Let me start by filling out a little bit of the context so that I can explain what I mean by Pemberton's challenge. I think this is something that you're all familiar with, but here is Descartes' one of the passages from Descartes' Principles of Philosophy that kind of present us with what's going to turn out to be the epistemic catastrophe that I mentioned earlier. So he says, it suffices if I've explained what imperceptible things may be like, even if perhaps they're not so. And then he elaborates on this by saying, for just as the same artisan can make two clocks which indicate the hours equally well and are exactly similar externally, but are internally composed of entirely dissimilar combination of small wheels, so there is no doubt that the greatest artificer of things could have made all those things which we see in many diverse ways. So for Descartes, the same observable phenomena are compatible with many different accounts of the arrangements and motions of the imperceptible parts, and we have no means to decide between them. So we've achieved the epistemic goal that he sets out for us of rendering the phenomena intelligible in terms of our metaphysics, but this success includes a limitation on what we can know, and the limitation expresses itself as this pretty nasty underdetermination. So we can think of Descartes' physics as being both underambitious and overambitious. It's underambitious in accepting weak constraints on acceptable knowledge that leave us with widespread underdetermination in physics. And it's overambitious in attempting to give a theory of everything, so a complete system. And this is, as many of you will know, be familiar with, this is something that was the subject of explicit criticism in the 18th century. And Henry Pemberton, who supervised the third edition of Newton's Principia, wrote about it in his book on Newton's philosophy. So he says, the custom was to frame conjectures, and if upon comparing them with things there appeared some kind of agreement, though very imperfect, it was held sufficient. Yet at the same time, nothing less was undertaken than entire systems. So what are we supposed to do instead? One thing we could do is demand certainty and demonstrations of the kind we find in mathematics. But the experimental philosophers were all clear that this is not the kind of knowledge that they're going to be able to deliver. That's not the epistemic situation we find ourselves in when it comes to the natural world. So here's Pemberton again. Oh, it must still not be this one. Yeah, here's Pemberton again. The proofs in natural philosophy cannot be so absolutely conclusive as in the mathematics. Our method of arguing must fall a little short of absolute perfection. And then you can find similar statements like this in all the sort of self-proclaimed Newtonians of the time. And the question is, okay, so what method should we use? And what is the epistemic status of the output of this method? Here's Newton himself. So this is the fourth rule for the study of natural philosophy that he added for the third edition of the Principia. So this is from 1726. And the rule says, in experimental philosophy, propositions gathered from the phenomena by induction should be considered either exactly or very nearly true, notwithstanding any contrary hypotheses, until yet other phenomena make such propositions either more exact or liable to exceptions. So the method is to gather propositions from the phenomena by induction, and the epistemic status of these propositions is that they should be considered either exactly or very nearly true. Well, this is obviously pretty terse. And if we turn to the natural philosophers who wrote about Newton and his rules of reasoning, we don't actually get a great deal more help. So I'm just going to stick with Pemberton again. Here's what he says. He says, the only method that can afford us any prospect of success in this difficult work is to make our inquiries with the utmost caution. For in this spacious field of nature, if we once forsake the true path, we shall immediately lose ourselves and must forever wander with uncertainty. But proceeding with utmost caution isn't a method. And I think that Pemberton goes on to give a clear statement of exactly the methodological challenge that Du Châtelet was responding to. So here's what I mean by Pemberton's challenge. He says, it's only here required to steer a just course between the conjectural method of proceeding, against which I have so largely spoke, and demanding so rigorous a proof as will reduce all philosophy to mere skepticism and exclude all prospect of making any progress in the knowledge of nature. So then the question is, how do we steer this just course? What's the method by which we can do this? And I think this is exactly the issue Du Châtelet is responding to with her two-pronged methodology in the Foundations of Physics. And I think it's important to remember when we're reading the Foundations that as far as explicit scientific methodology goes, Du Châtelet was stepping into a really kind of confused and confusing space. So there are things that we can find in Huygens, in Graf-Zandi, in Wolff, which I don't know whether she had access to or not, but it's kind of a big mess out there. So I think if we look at that space and look at all the different things that people were writing, Pemberton's challenge does a really nice job of isolating, what's at the heart of the issue of the day in terms of scientific methodology. And everyone here knows that Du Châtelet was just brilliant at identifying the most important issues in the Foundations of Physics as they were at the time that she was writing. So it would be no surprise if she saw that this was the issue and that she decided to address it. So that's the background. This is what I take to be Pemberton's challenge. And now I want to talk about Du Châtelet through the lens of Pemberton. So, of course, the most obvious place where she talks about method is her chapter on hypotheses. And I just want to put in front of you the familiar opening paragraph. So here's what it says, just to remind ourselves. The true causes of natural effects and of the phenomena we observe are often so far from the principles on which we can rely and the experiments we can make that one is obliged to be content with probable reasons to explain them. Thus, probabilities are not to be rejected in the sciences, not only because they are often of great practical use, but also because they clear the path that leads to truth. Okay, so here are the things I want us to just notice about this. There's lots of things we could say, but these are the things I want us to pay attention to. First of all, the goal she sets out here. We're looking for true causes of natural effects and of the phenomena we observe. I think she called her book Institution to Physique very deliberately. It's a book about physics, and physics at the time was a search for causes, for causal knowledge of the natural world in terms of the nature and properties of bodies. So when we're assessing her methodology, we have to ask how successful it is with respect to that goal. Second thing I want us to keep in mind is the epistemic gap, right? The gap between the true causes, which is what we're looking for, and what's epistemically accessible to us, given the kinds of creatures that we are, how we're situated in the world, what epistemic tools we have available to us. So the principles that we can rely on, the experiments we can make. So when we're assessing her methodology, we'll want to ask how at all, if at all, does it enable us to bridge this gap? Third thing we want to keep in mind is the limitation on what we can hope to achieve. So whatever method she's going to give us to try to bridge the gap between our goal and our epistemic situation, it's not going to be able to deliver certainty, right? At best, we're going to get probable reasons for the phenomena. So a good understanding of her methodology is going to make clear what the status is of the knowledge that her method delivers. And it's going to make clear what relationship these probable reasons have to the true causes that are our goal in doing physics. And then finally, the fourth thing that I want us to pay attention to is the epistemic utility of hypotheses. They clear the path to truth. So given the epistemic gap and given the limitation on what we can hope to achieve, hypotheses are a necessary part of the method by which we, as the kinds of creatures that we are, should pursue our goal of finding the true causes. So I want to keep those things in mind, set them to one side for now, and then come back to them at the end. Okay, so that's the setup. As you all know, the opening paragraphs of chapter 4 are all about how hypotheses are necessary and useful for the progress of physics. And then she moves to her discussion of what counts as good hypothesizing. And famously, she says this. She says, without doubt, there are rules to follow and pitfalls to be avoided in hypotheses. And then this is where we get her account of how to use experiments and empirical evidence to constrain our theorizing, to constrain the things that we say and that we commit to. And I think that what she says here is broadly familiar to everyone here, so I'm not going to go over it. If you're not familiar with it, there's a really interesting and growing secondary literature. And I think tomorrow's talks are going to give us time to spend on the details of this, which will be great. But I want to skip over that and not do that and stay kind of at a big picture scale of things, because what I want to suggest is that the account in chapter 4 of how to use experiments and empirical evidence to produce good hypotheses, one way to read this is as du Châtelet's initial response to Pemberton's challenge. This is her making explicit what we have to do to steer a just course between wild conjecture and not knowing anything at all, so kind of radical skepticism. So I'm going to have to do more to support this claim, but take it as a hypothesis for now, and let's see where it takes us. If we do this, then the next thing that I think we need to do is to compare the manuscript version of chapter 4 with the published version. And this will help give some support to this idea that she's responding to Pemberton's challenge, and also move us on to the second claim that I want to make. So if we compare the manuscript with the published version, we find that there are just a few small changes, but one of these changes is really super important. And this is the change that occurs in paragraph 61. This is the one that's at the top there, about without doubt there are rules to follow and pitfalls to be avoided in hypotheses, because in the manuscript version, she moves directly from that opening remark to the use of experiments and empirical evidence as constraints on a good hypothesis. But in the published version, we get the addition of the first prong of her method, right? The appeal to the principle of sufficient reason and to the principles of our knowledge more generally. So we get the move from just talking about the empirical evidence to having this two-pronged methodology. So the first rule to follow is that our hypotheses should not be in contradiction with the principle of sufficient reason, nor with any principles of the foundations of our knowledge. And the second rule is to have certain knowledge of the facts that are within our reach and to know all the circumstances attendant upon the phenomena that we want to explain. So this is her statement then of her two-pronged methodology as it appears in the published version of her book. So we have this small but really momentous change. And I think that it needs to be understood alongside another change that happens between the manuscript and the published version. So we know, this is something that Erin mentioned, we know that chapter 1 of the original manuscript version of the Foundations contained Newton's third rule of reasoning. So presumably all of the first 3 rules at least, perhaps also the fourth. I think Erin mentioned that he thinks the fourth was in there too. So we've known this for a long time, at least since the work of William Barber and Linda Gardner-Janik. And it allows us to draw an important conclusion, which is that in the original version, Du Châtelet began the same way that all the Newtonians began in their books on physics, with a discussion of method and with a discussion of method that includes Newton's rules of reasoning. So that's the manuscript version. But then in the published version, Newton's rules of reasoning have disappeared from chapter 1. And the principle of sufficient reason has been introduced into chapter 4 as the first prong of her method for evaluating hypotheses. So this change then allows us to draw another important conclusion, I think, which is that Du Châtelet came to believe that her original version, the single-pronged empirical method in the manuscript version of chapter 4, is insufficient to meet Pemberton's challenge. So she'd done her best to spell out a method consistent with the experimental philosophy that met Pemberton's challenge, and it wasn't enough. And I think it wasn't enough in 2 important ways. First, it's not enough in reining in our imaginations. So the experimentalists were still prone to conjectures or to wild speculations that go beyond the empirical evidence. They're prone to asserting the existence of atoms, to asserting in action at a distance, inherent causes in things, and nothing in the experimental method set out in chapter 4 puts constraints on that. So Anneliese Rey is one of the people who's argued that chapter 4 is all about placing constraints on our imagination. And I'm agreeing with her here and saying that the original version of chapter 4 falls short of meeting that goal. And then the second way in which it falls short is, I think, that Du Châtelet came to believe that the Newtonian method is inadequate for providing a secure epistemic foundation for underwriting claims to knowledge in physics, albeit that knowledge is going to be fallible. So what did she do in the face of this? She rewrote chapter 1. And this time around, it's not Newton's rules of reasoning that she's appealing to in chapter 1. It's Leibniz's principle of contradiction and sufficient reason. So we've heard a bit about this. Let me just remind us about what's in chapter 1. So as you know, it's entitled Of the Principles of Our Knowledge. She's very deliberate in using this phrase, our knowledge. It's not knowledge, it's human knowledge. Her concern is knowledge of the kind that's possible for creatures like us in the world that we find ourselves in. She rejects Descartes' reliance on clear and distinct ideas, saying that his method allows us to be misled by our imagination and leads to perpetual disputes. So we need a method that enables consensus, according to Du Châtelet. This demands that we reason from accepted principles, that we proceed by demonstration so as not to be misled by our imaginations. And we're supposed to admit only those conclusions that are agreed upon by all to follow from these principles. So this is what she says early in chapter 1. As you know, these two principles are the principle of contradiction and principle of sufficient reason. So just like with the chapter on hypotheses, there's a growing and very exciting literature on these two principles and how we're supposed to understand them in Du Châtelet. And again, I think we'll hear more about it tomorrow. But I want to, again, just sort of stay at a kind of big picture way of thinking about things at the moment. So Du Châtelet asserts that she's following Leibniz in adopting these two principles, but she has her own purposes in adopting them. Right? Her book is very deliberate and systematic in its structure. So I think, Katherine was exactly right to ask, why does she put the chapters on space and time where she puts them? And I think it's crucial for our understanding of Du Châtelet's use of PC and PSR that we pay attention to the roles that they play with respect to her own project. So I want us just to keep in mind what it is that she's trying to achieve in the foundations when we're doing our assessments of what we take the content of the principle of contradiction and the principle of sufficient reason to be for her. For her, uncontroversially, the principle of contradiction distinguishes the impossible from the impossible. And she writes that it is the foundation of all certainty in human knowledge, and without it, there could be no knowledge. Why? Because without it, quote, everything could be or not be according to the fantasy of each person, end quote. So one role here of the principle of contradiction is to put constraints on our use of our imaginations. And she's clear about the methodological importance. I don't know if I have this quote for you. Here we go. About the methodological importance of the principle of contradiction. This is how she concludes her discussion of that principle. She says, a very important rule results from the definition of the impossible that I have just given you. It is that when we advance that a thing is impossible, we are required to show that the same thing is simultaneously asserted and denied. This rule would avoid a great many disputes if it were followed. And then very importantly, she says, one should be just as cautious when maintaining that a thing, like atoms or like action at a distance, things Newtonians were fond of, we must be just as cautious when maintaining that a thing is possible, for one must be in a position to show that the idea is free of contradiction. So to adopt the principle of contradiction as a principle of our knowledge is to adopt a method of reasoning concerning that which is possible and impossible. What about PSR then? Well, as we know, within the domain of that which is possible, as determined by the principle of contradiction, lie those things whose truth or falsehood is merely contingent, and this is where PSR comes in, the tool for arriving at contingent truths. And Du Châtelet writes that, quote, when it is possible for a thing to be in several states, the principle of contradiction is insufficient for determining its actual state, and PSR is required. We must provide a reason for why a thing is in one of its possible states rather than another, and this is something that a good hypothesis will do. So I think it's true that the principle of contradiction, the principle of sufficient reason, provide the first prong of her method for arriving at good hypotheses in physics. And I also think we see her using them in just this way later in the foundations. Okay, so now so I think all that is like familiar and doesn't depend at all on, doesn't depend in particular on thinking of her as responding to Pemberton's challenge. So now I want to do a bit more. So my suggestion was that Du Châtelet came to believe that her original count in chapter 4 was insufficient to meet Pemberton's challenge in two ways. The first of which was that it was insufficient to reign in our imaginations. So this modification, this addition of a new prong of her methodology addresses that shortcoming. And I'm going to give you some more evidence for that in a minute. But there was also the second shortcoming that I mentioned concerning the epistemic foundations of scientific knowledge. So I want to say a little bit about that first. And this takes us to the reason why these principles of contradiction and sufficient reason need to be in chapter 1, right at the beginning of the book, rather than waiting until chapter 4 to get to them. Because everything I've said so far has just been about, well, we need them here as in chapter 4 as one of the prongs of her method. So why in chapter 1? Well, this is about the second limitation of the Newtonian method as she encountered it. For du Châtelet, the principle of contradiction and the principle of sufficient reason must be presupposed in order for knowledge to be possible at all. And I think this speaks to some of the questions that Erin was raising about what kinds of reasoning are possible given the principle of sufficient reason. So here are the first 4 chapters of the foundations. And the first thing that these principles do is get us from knowledge of our own existence to knowledge of the existence of God, something Natalia mentioned. More specifically, du Châtelet uses the 2 principles to argue for the existence of a necessary being, which she calls God, and for God being immutable. She uses PSR as a causal principle in this context, but that's a detail maybe we can talk about that later. So once we have knowledge of God's existence, we know that the principle of contradiction and the truths that we obtain for it hold always and forever. Right? So it gives us this extra knowledge. And this is because the principle of contradiction obtains in God's understanding, which is itself unchanging. God is immutable. And this is what gets us to knowledge of essences in chapter 3, into our knowledge that these are unchanging. So it gets us to our knowledge of unchanging essences. So yeah, God's immutability is what ensures the constancy of essences, and that in turn makes knowledge of them possible. And the reason why that's important for du Châtelet's overall project in the foundations is something that Andrew Janiak has talked about, and I think he's right. So this is like a kind of a first glimpse of the foundational role of the principle of contradiction in making knowledge possible. And it immediately connects back to the methodological role for these principles of our knowledge. So notice what du Châtelet says here. She says, this single truth of the immutability of essences at a stroke banishes from philosophy all precarious hypotheses and all the monsters arising from the imagination of men, which have so held back the progress of sciences and of the sciences and of the human mind. And here, one of the things she includes is Locke's thinking matter. So I think that this supports the earlier claim that one of du Châtelet's goals here is to use the principle of contradiction to rein in the imagination, whether that's of the Cartesians or of the Newtonians or of whoever. So where earlier on in her thinking, earlier in the 1730s, she'd been willing to allow God's will as an explanation within physics. Now she thinks that that's a cop-out, a problematic limitation on what we can know. In her new account, things being possible doesn't depend on God's will, but on his understanding. And so one must not admit anything as true in philosophy when one cannot give any reason for its possibility other than the will of God, as she says in chapter 3. So it's only through the use of the principle of contradiction that we're allowed to admit something as possible. Okay, so that's the principle of contradiction, and it's doing these 2 things, right, of constraining our imaginations and of making knowledge possible. But of course, it doesn't get us to knowledge of what's actual. For that, we need the principle of sufficient reason. And again, we need it in 2 ways. One is to show that any given being is actual rather than possible. And then the other is to explain the modes of things, to show how a being depends on its neighbor, and which causes gave actuality to the modes that were simply possible when the being was considered as isolated and outside the order of things. So again, we're putting much tighter constraints on what counts as a good hypothesis than du Châtelet allowed in her first attempt, in the manuscript attempt to meet Pemberton's challenge. So constraining our imaginations. What about the epistemic foundations of our knowledge? I think that to say that the role of the principle of sufficient reason is to help us arrive at contingent truths really underplays the significance of the principle of sufficient reason. So yes, it does this, and this is explicit in chapter 4, but it's doing a lot more than that. Because as with the principle of contradiction, the principle of sufficient reason has to be presupposed in order for knowledge to be possible, and in this case, in order for knowledge of contingent truths to be possible at all. Without PSR, there's no reasoning from effects to causes, and this means that nothing in Newton's rules of reasoning makes any sense. So this is where we come to the role of PSR in relation to the issue of epistemic foundations. And this is something I talked a bit about in my book. I think du Châtelet makes a series of 4 points that support the acceptance of PSR as a necessary prerequisite for the very possibility of knowledge. Here's her first point. She says, if we try to deny this great principle, we would fall into strange contradictions. For as soon as one accepts that something may happen without sufficient reason, one cannot be sure of anything. For example, that a thing is the same as it was the moment before, since this thing could change at any moment into another of a different kind. Thus, truths for us would exist only for an instant. So this is obviously a skeptical worry. And I think du Châtelet was clear about the epistemological challenge of needing something to tie events together from moment to moment, because without this, we can't make any inferences beyond the particular moment in which we find ourselves. So we can't kind of get scientific reasoning off the ground. And she gives this example in support of her point about her room. So I think du Châtelet here is responding to Pemberton's plea that we avoid outright skepticism by accepting PSR as a prerequisite for the possibility of knowledge. It's the means by which we tie the succession of events together, such that we can reason from one state of affairs at one time to another state of affairs at another time. Without this, we can't reason about causes and effects, and therefore no inductive reasoning of the kind we use in experimental philosophy would be possible. Châtelet's second point is that PSR is also required for us to make comparisons, including the comparisons involved in making measurements. These involve equality, inequality, identity, difference, and du Châtelet's claim is that without PSR, there can't be any measurements, and so empirical science wouldn't be possible. And here the example she gives concerns the weight of objects. So there's the example up there about how we weigh things on a balance. And I think her choice here of weight is very deliberate. Newton's Principia is all about gravity, and the argument of the Principia depends completely on measurements of weight, from weighing terrestrial objects to him weighing the moon, and his argument that gravitation is the same force that's holding the moon in its orbit as makes bodies fall. So du Châtelet's position, which I think is implied, she doesn't say this explicitly, but I think it's fairly strongly implied here, is that unless we presuppose PSR, the reasoning on which the argument of the Principia is based simply doesn't go through. I'm going to skip over du Châtelet's third point. This is about PSR and arguments from design, and just briefly mention her fourth point, which is about how we distinguish truths from fantasies of the imagination. So here she talks about Descartes' dreaming argument and the associated skepticism, and she invokes PSR as a tool by which we are able to distinguish a dreamt world from waking reality. So in the same way, she goes on to say that PSR is the tool by which we're able to distinguish fable and fiction from reality. So it's by means of PSR, according to du Châtelet, that we can constrain our theorizing so as to fill our books of philosophy with truths instead of fantasies. Okay, so all of that is to say that there are these two important roles for the principles of our knowledge. One is in our methods. They rein in our imaginations and place restrictions on admissible hypotheses. And the other is that we have to presuppose them in order to ensure a secure epistemic foundation for our theorizing. We have to presuppose the principle of contradiction and of sufficient reason. We have to presuppose that they hold in order for knowledge to be possible at all. And we have to presuppose that PSR holds in order for our experimental methods, comparisons, measurements, and our reasoning, so our reasoning involving causes and effects, for example, about contingent truths to be justified. So I think that we can read this as du Châtelet completing her response to Pemberton's challenge. And I think it's a very effective response. Okay, so obviously I am reading the opening 4 chapters through a particular lens, as I mentioned, as offering a response to Pemberton's challenge. Pemberton asked, what's the appropriate method for proceeding, and what is the epistemic justification for this method? I think we get fruitful insights into all 4 of these opening chapters of du Châtelet's Foundations by reading them in this way. So that would be an implicit case for, in fact, reading them in this way, because it helps us to see important things about what's going on in her philosophy. It helps us to see important relationships between the different things that she's saying in chapter 3 in relation to 2 and 1 and 4 and so on. We can see kind of it brings out some of the argument structure and how they're tied together in those chapters. So that would be one kind of implicit case for using Pemberton's challenge as a way to frame our thinking about chapters 1 to 4. I think there's also an explicit case, and this is something that I've talked about a bit before. I think that her opening chapters, we can think about her opening chapters being concerned with this, with the question of method, or more precisely with the question of the epistemological, the question of sort of the status and limits of our knowledge of the world. And then, so that's an epistemological question, but it's intimately tied to the methodological question of how it is that we can achieve knowledge in physics. So I think, given the way that I've set things up, it's worth maybe just repeating a couple of reasons for thinking this. One is just her explicit statements in the preface and in chapters 1 to 4. There are things that she says that make it sound very much as if she's framing things in this way. A second one is her overall goals for the Foundations. So I think she's, as I mentioned, very deliberate and systematic in this book, and in the order of her presentation, and in providing the resources she needs for the questions that she's trying to answer. So I think that we have to keep a firm grip on the whole kind of argumentative arc of the book when we're trying to interpret any one chapter or any one passage. And if we do that, then this indicates that the book is directed at an account of the nature and properties of bodies, and an account that makes clear how it is that bodies act causally on one another. And this argumentative arc, if we think about things in this way, then what we see in her book is an indication that she thought that neither the Cartesian methods nor the Newtonian methods could deliver on answering these questions, right? And so what do we need in order to be able to answer these questions? We need to add something more to the method. What are we going to need? She thinks the principles of contradiction and sufficient reason. She thinks that these are kind of the missing piece of the methodological puzzle that she was looking for. If that's the right way of thinking about the overall goals of the book and why she introduced these, then when we're trying to interpret what she meant by these principles and the extent to which they succeed or fail, we should do that in relation to this question of the nature and properties of bodies and how it is they interact on one another. So that's kind of one reason for thinking about these chapters in this sort of epistemic methodological kind of key. I think there's also the wider contextual evidence. This is something that Katherine Dunlop kindly mentioned, that if we think about the context in which she came to write the Foundations, then we know that she was reading Newtonian physics textbooks at the time. And if we add to that her explicit statement that she wanted to replace Rouault's out-of-date book on physics, then it's a natural thought to think that she took the Newtonian physics textbook as her model. If that's right, then we'd expect her book to have the same topics and order of presentation as those textbooks, and it does. The main open question is how to read these first 4 chapters that at first sight look unusual when we're comparing her book with the Newtonian physics textbook she read. But all these books begin with a discussion of method and the inevitable kind of epistemological issues that come along with that. So what I argued for in my book was we should begin by reading du Châtelet's opening chapters in this methodological key 2, because of the models that we have good reason to think that she was taking as her starting point for writing her book. So if I'm right about that, then it has the consequence that we shouldn't read these early chapters as being primarily motivated by the metaphysical concerns that we see her addressing. So obviously, these chapters contain significant amounts of metaphysics, but I don't think that this is because her primary purpose in writing these chapters was to provide a metaphysical foundation for physics. I think it's her concerns over epistemology and methodology that drive the introduction of the metaphysical content of her book. So I think that when we're examining and assessing her metaphysics, we should keep in mind the goals with which she introduced this material into philosophy. I'm not disputing that she was seeking an adequate foundation for physics, and I'm not disputing that this involves metaphysical commitments. These things come together as a package. My claim is that the primary engine of her foundational inquiry is the search for an appropriate methodology by which to achieve an epistemically secure physics. So she's trying to respond to Pemberton's challenge. In so doing, she needs to have this package of epistemology and method that will also involve making metaphysical commitments. So when we're thinking about her metaphysical commitments, we should also be thinking about those within the context of Pemberton's challenge. So what the opening chapters put in place are what has to be the case for scientific knowledge to be possible at all, what sorts of things can be known via the principles of our knowledge, a method for using the principles of our knowledge plus empirical resources for arriving at scientific knowledge, what the limits of that knowledge are, and this includes the epistemic status of those knowledge claims. So those are the things that we really need sort of clarity about with respect to those first 4 chapters. So I want to finish by going back to chapter 4 and to the 4 points that I drew your attention to at the beginning of my talk. So the first was that the goal that we're looking for is that we're trying to find the true causes of natural effects and of the phenomena we observe. And I think this goal remains unchanged by the kinds of things that we've been talking about. I think it's pretty clear that this is what she was trying to do. And as I said at the outset, du Châtelet was deliberate in choosing to write a book about physics. And at the time, physics was the search for causes, and so for causal knowledge of the natural world. And my claim then is that she came to see the Newtonian method, even when it's strengthened by this elaboration of Newtonian thinking in chapter 4. And I'm quite sympathetic here to Aaron Wells's thought that that we can see the presence of Newton's rules of reasoning in chapter 4. So even when she sort of strengthens Newton's rules of reasoning by the working out that she does in the original version of chapter 4, I think she came to see that this wasn't strong enough to enable her to reason about causes and to arrive at causal knowledge. And it was the adding of the second prong to her method that enabled her to do this. When it comes to the epistemic gap, so this is the gap between the true causes, the things that we're looking for, and what's epistemically accessible to us. I haven't really talked about this today, but PSR obviously has a very important role. So this is also where the non-mechanical physical properties like elasticity come in. This is something that Cho Lin has talked about. And originally, this is what I was hoping to get to. I wanted to connect up with Joe's work, but as we all know, talks take on a life of their own, and I didn't quite get there when I was kind of trying to work through things. So set that to one side for now. The third thing is this limitation on what we can hope to achieve. And at the beginning, I said that a deep understanding of her methodology will make clear what the status is of the knowledge that her method delivers. And I think that I hope that this talk makes a little bit of progress on that. So I'll say something about that in a minute. It's connected to this fourth item of the epistemic utility of hypotheses. Right, so we already knew that given the epistemic gap and the limitation on what we can hope to achieve, hypotheses are a necessary part of the method by which we, as the kind of creatures that we are, should pursue our goal of finding true causes. But I think du Châtelet's analysis transforms the status of hypotheses in relation to scientific knowledge. So I want to just finish up by saying a few words about that. So here's the thought. The upshot of du Châtelet's response to Pemberton's challenge is a transformation of what we mean by scientific knowledge. So that scientific knowledge, which is already kind of an anachronistic term, but I'm going to use another one now, scientific knowledge on her account is justified hypothesis. So it's not certain truth. So many people at the time argued for relaxing the criterion of certainty when it comes to knowledge in physics. But it was left under-theorized what to say about the epistemic status of the resulting propositions. Right? Newton says, well, we should take them as true, and so on. And du Châtelet is saying, no, we shouldn't mistake them for truths. They're hypotheses, or maybe theories, as we might say today. They're hypotheses that can be more or less good, which is just to say that they can have stronger or weaker justification. And that justification comes from the application of the two-pronged methodology that's set out in chapter 4. So here's how I want to kind of pull all this together. So the suggestion is that we can read the early chapters of du Châtelet as responding to what I've called Pemberton's challenge, and that this is the fundamental methodological and epistemological challenge that was facing natural philosophers in the wake of Newton's Principia. We can then think of the principles of our knowledge as playing two roles in responding to this challenge. The first is as a constraint on a good hypothesis, and the second is in securing epistemic foundations for scientific knowledge. This is what makes the practices of the experimental philosophers epistemically justified. And then the third claim then is that du Châtelet's response to Pemberton's challenge transforms the epistemic status of these knowledge claims in physics. What we get in her foundations is a fully theorized account of their uncertainty and of their justification as knowledge. So looking back from our present day perspective, I think this is the upshot of her analysis. I think it is deep and thorough, and I think that, as usual, she was ahead of her time. So thank you.